Frank Donovan was not the kind of man who sought attention. He didn't care for fame or glory. In fact, if you saw him walking down the street, you'd probably think he was just another elderly man going about his day. He had silver hair, walked, with a bit of a limp, and wore simple clothes, usually a faded jacket and an old pair of boots that had clearly seen better days. His face had deep lines, not just from age, but from years of memories, many of which he kept buried deep inside. Frank lived in a quiet little town near the coast, where the ocean could be heard crashing against the shore every morning. He had moved there years ago, not long after his wife passed away. Since then, he lived alone in a small house, with nothing but a black and white photo of his SEAL team on the wall and a dog-eared American flag folded neatly in a display case. The neighbors knew him as the quiet man down the street. They'd wave when they saw him, and he'd wave back, but not much more than that. What most people didn't know, what no one knew anymore, was that Frank was once a highly respected Navy SEAL. Decades ago, during the Vietnam War, he had been part of one of the most dangerous and elite teams in the military. His team was known for their bravery, their skill, and their loyalty to one another. They went on missions so secret that even their families never heard about them. They rescued prisoners of war, sabotaged enemy supplies, and protected fellow soldiers in the most dangerous parts of the jungle. Frank had once been their leader, a man other soldiers looked up to and trusted with their lives. But war has a way of leaving marks, not just on the body, but on the heart and mind. When Frank returned home, he didn't feel like a hero. He didn't want to talk about what he had seen or what he had done. He didn't attend parades or Veterans Day events. He didn't show off his medals or wear his old uniform. He packed everything into a dusty shoebox and pushed it to the back of his closet. The only reminder of his past that he couldn't hide was the tattoo on his left forearm. It was a trident wrapped in eagle wings, a special mark that only a few elite SEALs had. It was a symbol of his team, a bond that no time or distance could ever break. The tattoo had faded over the years, the lines softer now, the colors dull, but it was still there. Sometimes, when Frank rolled up his sleeves without thinking, it would peek out, but no one ever noticed. No one ever asked. Frank didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it that way. He had done his duty. He had seen too many young men die. He had lost close friends, including his best friend Miller, who had died during a mission gone wrong. That moment haunted him still, more than 50 years later. Frank lived quietly because it hurt too much to remember, and he believed that. No one cared anymore. The world had moved on. People were too busy with their phones, their selfies, their social media. Who remembered men like him? Who still cared about stories from a war that most people had forgotten? Every morning, Frank followed the same routine. He'd wake up early, feed the stray cat that came to his door, make a cup of coffee, and take a slow walk down to the local park. He liked sitting on the old bench near the fountain. The sound of water calmed him. Sometimes he'd bring a newspaper, though he barely read it. He just liked the feeling of holding it. The park was usually filled with joggers, kids playing, and people walking their dogs. They all walked past him, barely noticing the man sitting alone on the bench. Sometimes, after the park, he'd walk to a small cafe near the pier. The staff there knew him by face but not by name. He'd sit at the same corner booth, order a black coffee and a plain bagel, and stare out the window. The ocean reminded him of his younger days, of missions launched from Navy ships, of long nights listening to the waves and wondering if he'd live to see the next sunrise. The cafe was quiet in the mornings. Frank liked that. He didn't talk much, and no one expected him to. Occasionally, he'd overhear conversations, young people talking about things he didn't understand, like video games or crypto coins or influencers. He'd shake his head, with a small smile. The world had changed so much. He felt like a ghost from another time. One morning, while sipping his coffee, he caught a glimpse of a couple arguing at the next table. The man was angry, waving his hands. The woman looked like she was about to cry. Frank turned away, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the sight reminded him of his wife. She had been his anchor. He remembered how she used to wait by the window when he was deployed, how she'd send him letters filled with love and hope. She had passed from cancer 10 years ago, and since then, Frank had spoken even less. She had been the only person he really opened up to. As he sat there, lost in thought, he didn't notice the young man who had just entered the cafe. That young man was Jake Lawson, a freshly trained Navy SEAL on leave. He had just completed a tough mission overseas, one that had left his team shaken. One of their senior members, a man Jake had looked up to like a big brother, had been killed during a rescue operation. Jake hadn't had time to grieve properly. The military moved fast, and emotions were something you learned to lock away. But Jake had needed to get away. His commanding officer had suggested a quiet weekend off the grid, and so here he was, in this small coastal town, hoping to find some peace. Jake wasn't looking for anything in particular. He just wanted a moment to breathe, to be anonymous, to sit somewhere and not be a SEAL, not be responsible for others, not carry the weight of war on his shoulders. He entered the cafe, ordered a coffee, and looked for a place to sit. Most tables were full except for one near the corner beside an old man. He hesitated, then shrugged and walked over. As he passed, something caught his eye. The old man, Frank, was reaching for his wallet to pay the bill. As he did, the sleeve of his jacket slid up just enough to reveal part of a tattoo. Jake's eyes locked on it. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was the trident and eagle, the exact design that Jake had seen in SEAL history books and training manuals. A special emblem used only by a specific group of Vietnam-era SEALs. A group led by someone the younger SEALs considered a legend, a man named Chief Frank Donovan, a man who had once been thought lost to history. Jake stood there frozen, his tray in his hand, his mind racing. Could it be? Could this quiet, wrinkled, lonely man really be that Donovan? He stared harder, but Frank didn't notice. The old man was putting a $5 bill on the table, unaware that anyone was watching. Him? Jake felt his throat dry up. His training told him to be respectful, to wait, to observe. But his heart told him to speak. Slowly, carefully, he walked over to the booth. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Were you in the Navy?" Frank looked up. His eyes were sharp but cautious. "I was," he said simply. Jake swallowed hard. "A SEAL?" There was a pause. Frank looked him over. His gaze settled on the small trident pin Jake wore on his own jacket. Frank gave a nod. Jake felt a chill. "I saw your tattoo," he said quietly. "I think I know who you are." Frank didn't reply. He was used to being ignored, not recognized. He wasn't sure how to respond. Jake lowered his voice even more. Then, as if speaking an oath, he said the old team motto, words passed down from the Vietnam teams to the modern SEALs. Not for glory, not for gain, only for the man beside. Me. Frank blinked. The words hit him hard. No one had said those words to him in decades. Memories came rushing back. The jungle, the rain, his teammates, the moments before battle. He looked at Jake again, this time with different eyes. "You know that motto?" he asked. Jake nodded. "We still say it. In training. In the field. Your story. Your team. We've all heard it." Frank looked away for a moment. Then he quietly said, "I didn't think anyone remembered." Jake pulled out a chair and sat down, uninvited but welcomed. And in that moment, something powerful happened. A bridge formed between two men from two different wars, two different generations, but with the same fire in their hearts. Frank Donovan, the forgotten hero, had just been recognized. Not by the world, not by a crowd, but by someone who truly understood. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He felt remembered. And that changed everything. Jake Lawson had always known the Navy SEAL life was tough, but nothing prepared him for the weight of it all after his latest mission. He was young, just in his late 20s, but he had already seen things most people couldn't imagine. War was brutal, and it wasn't just the enemy that made it so hard. It was the loss of brothers in arms, the unspoken pain, the heavy silence that followed every operation. Jake felt exhausted, not just physically, but deep in his soul. His team had recently completed a high-risk mission in a remote area overseas, tasked with rescuing hostages held by a dangerous militant group. The mission was supposed to be quick, precise, and clean. But as with so many things in war, it didn't go as planned. Jake's closest mentor, Lieutenant Cole Harris, had been shot during the extraction. Cole was like an older brother to Jake, experienced, strong, and always watching out for him. Losing Cole hit Jake harder than he expected. Back on base, Jake found it difficult to talk about what happened. The military culture often told them to stay strong, not show weakness, keep moving forward. But Jake felt stuck. He kept replaying the mission in his mind, wondering if he could have done something different, something better. He was haunted by the faces of his fallen friends. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the battlefield and heard the gunfire. His commanding officer noticed his mood and suggested Jake take some time off. A quiet weekend, somewhere peaceful, away from the noise and stress. That's how Jake found himself in the small coastal town where Frank Donovan lived. Jake didn't expect to find anything special in the town. It was a simple place with a few shops, a cafe by the pier, and a slow rhythm of life that seemed a world away from the chaos of war. But even in this calm place, Jake felt restless. He was searching for something, maybe peace, maybe answers, maybe just a moment to breathe. He wandered the streets, trying to clear his mind. He watched the waves crash against the rocks, smelled the salty air, and listened to the cries of seagulls. It was beautiful, but Jake couldn't shake the heaviness. Inside. On the second day of his visit, Jake walked into the small cafe near the pier. The cafe was cozy, with wooden tables and old pictures on the walls. It smelled like fresh coffee and baked bread. Jake wasn't hungry, but he ordered a black coffee and found a quiet corner to sit. He wanted to be alone, but not lonely. As he sipped his coffee, Jake noticed an old man sitting by the window. The man was quiet, staring out at the ocean. His hair was white, and his skin was weathered. There was a calm sadness about him. Jake couldn't take his eyes off him. The old man seemed lost in thought, but something about him felt familiar. Jake's military training kicked in, and he studied the man more closely. That's when he saw the tattoo on the man's forearm, a trident wrapped in eagle wings. It was the same emblem Jake had seen in his SEAL training, the symbol of a legendary Vietnam-era SEAL team. Jake's heart pounded. Could this be the man he had heard about in stories? The chief who had led his team through impossible missions? He didn't want to disturb the old man, but couldn't resist. He had to know. Jake approached the table slowly and said, "Excuse me, sir. I noticed your tattoo. Are you a Navy SEAL?" The old man looked up, surprised but calm. "Yes, I was," he replied quietly. Jake introduced himself and explained he was also a Navy SEAL, part of a new generation. He told the old man about the mission he had just come from and about losing his mentor. As Jake spoke, he noticed the old man listening, carefully, his eyes full of understanding. They started talking, slowly at first. Frank, the old man, shared bits of his past, stories of missions in the jungle, the challenges his team faced, and the pain of losing friends. He spoke about the bond that held them together, a bond stronger than fear, stronger than death. Jake listened, fascinated and moved. The more Frank talked, the more Jake felt connected. Here was a man who had lived through what he was experiencing now. Frank's words gave Jake a new perspective on sacrifice, courage, and the true meaning of brotherhood. The cafe around them seemed to fade away as the two men shared their stories. Other customers noticed the quiet respect between them but didn't interrupt. It was a sacred moment, two warriors from different eras finding strength in each other. As the conversation deepened, Jake realized that despite the years and the different wars, the essence of being a SEAL hadn't changed. It was still about loyalty, honor, and the unbreakable bond with the man beside you. Frank encouraged Jake not to carry his burdens alone. He reminded him that it was okay to feel pain, and that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness. By the time they finished their coffee, Jake felt lighter. He knew he wasn't alone anymore. Frank had reminded him that the legacy of SEALs wasn't just about battles won or medals earned. It was about carrying each other through the darkest times. Before leaving the cafe, Jake promised to come back and visit. Frank smiled, a small spark of hope returning to his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose again, not just as a veteran of a past war, but as a guide and friend to a new generation. As Jake walked away from the cafe, he looked back and saw Frank watching the ocean once more, but this time with a faint smile on his lips. The connection they had formed was a reminder that no matter how much time passed, the spirit of the SEALs lived on. Jake returned to his hotel that day with a renewed sense of hope and determination. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with the wisdom of Frank Donovan and the strength of his own team behind him, he was ready to face whatever challenges came next. That quiet weekend in the small town had given Jake more than peace. It had given him a new family, a new mission, and a new reason to believe in himself. The moment Jake saw the tattoo on Frank Donovan's forearm, something inside him froze. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a symbol filled with history, courage, and sacrifice. For Jake, a young Navy SEAL, this was not just any old man with a fading tattoo. This was a living legend. But even as his heart pounded with excitement and disbelief, he also felt a deep respect and an unexpected hesitation. Jake had spent countless hours during his training studying the stories of SEALs who came before him. He had listened to tales of bravery and missions that seemed almost impossible. Frank Donovan was one of those heroes. Frank's name was whispered in training halls as the chief who had led his team through some of the toughest times in the Vietnam War. He was a man who had survived battles, saved lives, and made decisions that changed the course of history. Many younger SEALs believed he was a myth, too extraordinary to be real. But here he was, sitting quietly in a corner of a small cafe, an old man with a tired smile and eyes that held countless memories. Jake's mind raced. He wondered how Frank felt sitting there so unnoticed by the world, carrying stories that were too heavy to share. For a long moment, Jake just stood there trying to gather his courage. Then, softly, he spoke the words that would break the silence and start a connection that neither man expected. "Sir, were you a SEAL?" Frank looked up, surprised by the question. He studied Jake's face, a young man, clearly a soldier, but also someone who carried his own burdens. There was something honest and respectful in Jake's voice, something that touched Frank's guarded heart. "Yes," Frank said simply. Jake nodded, then took a deep breath and introduced himself. He explained who he was, where he came from, and why he was there in that small town. He spoke about the mission he had just returned from, about the loss of his mentor, and the weight of responsibility that felt heavier than ever. Frank listened quietly, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. He could see the pain, the confusion, and the determination all mixed inside the young man. He saw in Jake the same fire he had once carried, a fire that sometimes burned too bright and sometimes flickered with doubt. Then Jake did something unexpected. He whispered the old SEAL motto, "Not for glory, not for gain, only for the man beside me." Those words hung in the air between them, filled with meaning and history. Frank's eyes softened, and a faint smile touched his lips. The words brought back memories, memories of his teammates, of missions where trust and loyalty were everything, and of a brotherhood that survived even the darkest nights. Frank nodded slowly. "I haven't heard those words in a long time," he said quietly. The two men sat down together, the young SEAL and the old veteran, bridging decades with their shared bond. They began to talk, not as strangers, but as brothers in arms. Frank told Jake stories that he had never told anyone before. He spoke of the jungle nights, the impossible odds, and the friends he lost along the way. He told of the mission where they had to rescue prisoners, knowing that one wrong step could mean death. He spoke of courage, not just the kind that shows in battle, but the quiet courage to keep going when all hope seems lost. Jake listened with rapt attention, feeling every word deep inside. He realized that these stories were more than history. They were lessons. Lessons about sacrifice, honor, and the true meaning of loyalty. He felt a connection to Frank that went beyond the past. It was a link to the future, a reminder of what it meant to be a SEAL. The cafe around them faded into the background. Other customers noticed the intensity of their conversation but wisely gave them space. This was a sacred moment, a passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. Frank shared his fears too. The fear of being forgotten, of the world moving on without remembering the sacrifices made. He spoke of the loneliness that came with being a veteran, of the pain of seeing younger men sent into wars he had once fought in, knowing the cost. Jake understood in a new way. He saw that being a SEAL wasn't just about physical strength or skill. It was about heart. It was about carrying the weight of those who came before and those who would come after. As the hours passed, Frank began to open up more. He talked about his wife, who had been his rock, and how her death left a hole in his life that no mission ever could fill. He spoke of his team, how they had been more than soldiers. They had been family. Jake shared too, his doubts, his grief, and his hopes. He told Frank about the pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness, and how that sometimes felt impossible. Frank listened, nodding, offering silent support. By the end of their conversation, something had changed. Jake felt renewed, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Frank felt lighter, as if a long-held secret had finally been shared. Before Jake left the cafe that day, he promised Frank he would come back. He wanted to learn more, to hear more stories, and to carry Frank's legacy forward. Frank smiled, the first genuine smile in a long time. He realized that his story wasn't over yet. Not while there were still brothers like Jake ready to listen, to learn, and to honor the past. As Jake stepped outside, he looked back one last time. Frank was sitting by the window again, looking out at the ocean. But this time, there was hope in his eyes. Jake knew that their meeting was no accident. It was fate. A moment where past and present met, where two warriors from different times found strength in each other. And from that day forward, their bond would grow stronger, bridging the gap between generations, and reminding both men that the spirit of the SEALs would never die. After that unforgettable meeting in the cafe, Jake found himself visiting Frank Donovan almost every day. Each visit was a new chapter, a deeper dive into stories and lessons that carried the weight of generations. Jake was no longer just a young SEAL searching for peace. He was becoming a bridge between the past and the future, and Frank's wisdom was guiding him through the shadows that haunted his mind. Frank, once a solitary figure living quietly in the small coastal town, began to feel alive again. The loneliness that had pressed down on him for years started to lift. He hadn't realized how much he needed this connection, this chance to share his life and legacy with someone who truly understood. Their conversations grew longer and richer. Frank told Jake about the true meaning behind the tattoo on his arm, the symbol of the trident wrapped in eagle wings. It was more than just a mark. It was a badge of honor, representing courage, strength, and sacrifice. Each element told a story. The trident, Frank explained, was the weapon of Poseidon, the god of the sea. It symbolized control over the ocean, the ability to navigate the most dangerous waters. For Navy SEALs, the sea was both a home and a battlefield. Mastering it meant mastering survival itself. The eagle wings represented freedom and vision. SEALs had to see beyond the obvious, anticipate danger, and strike with precision. They were warriors who fought for the freedom of others, soaring above fear and doubt. Frank said the tattoo reminded him every day that he was part of something bigger, a brotherhood that transcended time and place. When Jake saw it up close, he felt a surge of pride. He understood that wearing the tattoo was like carrying a promise to protect, to serve, and to never forget the cost of their mission. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the ocean, Frank shared a story that struck Jake deeply. It was about a mission so dangerous and complicated that many thought it impossible. Frank's team had been sent deep into hostile territory to rescue prisoners of war held in a hidden jungle camp. The mission required absolute stealth, trust, and determination. They had to move quietly through dense jungle, evade enemy patrols, and face unknown dangers at every step. Frank described the thick humidity, the buzzing insects, and the tension that filled every moment. The rescue was successful, but it came at a great price. Frank lost several friends that day, men who had been more than teammates, more like brothers. He talked about the grief and guilt that followed, about the struggle to accept that sometimes even the bravest and best can't save everyone. Jake listened quietly, feeling the weight of Frank's words. He understood now that war wasn't just about heroism and victories. It was also about loss and sacrifice. The stories he had heard in training were real, painful, and sometimes heartbreaking. Frank also talked about the moments of hope, how the rescued prisoners, once freed, showed courage and resilience that inspired his team. Those moments reminded Frank why they fought, why they risked everything. It was for those flashes of light in the darkest times. As days passed, Jake shared more about his own experiences. He told Frank about the young SEALs he worked with, the tight bonds they formed, and the constant pressure to stay strong. He talked about the new challenges modern warfare brought, the technology, the changing enemies, and the psychological toll. Frank listened and nodded, impressed by Jake's insight and dedication. Despite the years between them, the core of their work was the same. They were both warriors shaped by the sea, by the brotherhood, and by the relentless pursuit of peace through strength. One day Frank surprised Jake with a gift, a small worn notebook. It was filled with Frank's handwritten notes, sketches, and reflections from his time as a SEAL. The pages held wisdom, lessons, and stories that hadn't been shared with anyone else. Frank said he wanted Jake to have it, to carry on the legacy, and to remember that every generation of SEALs stood on the shoulders of those who came before. Jake felt honored and humbled. The notebook was more than just paper. It was a symbol of trust and continuity. Their bond grew stronger, not just as veterans, but as friends. They talked about family, life after service, and the difficulties many soldiers faced when returning home. Frank shared how he struggled with loneliness after retiring, and how the memories of war sometimes made peace elusive. Jake admitted his own fears about the future, whether he could leave the military someday, how he would find purpose outside the battlefield, and how he could honor those who didn't make it back. Frank gave him advice that was both simple and profound. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders alone. Find your people. Lean on them. And remember that courage isn't just about facing danger, it's about facing yourself. As their conversations continued, Jake noticed a change in himself. He was becoming more open, more willing to share his fears and hopes. He started seeing therapy not as a weakness, but as a tool, a way to heal and grow. Frank encouraged him to speak to other veterans and share his story. He told Jake that silence often bred pain, but speaking out could bring understanding and relief. It was a message Jake took to heart. One afternoon, Frank and Jake sat together watching the waves crash against the rocks. The sun was setting, painting the sky with oranges and pinks. Frank looked at Jake and said, "You remind me of myself when I was your age, full of fire and promise." Jake smiled, feeling a deep gratitude for the old man who had become his mentor. "And you remind me of what I want to be, a man who carries the past with honor and the future with hope." That evening, Jake left Frank's house feeling stronger than he had in months. He knew the road ahead was still full of challenges, but with Frank's guidance and the bond they shared, he was ready to face them. Their story wasn't just about war, it was about healing, friendship, and the unbreakable spirit of those who serve. It was a reminder that no matter how far apart the generations, the heart of a SEAL beats the same. Courageous, loyal, and forever connected. After spending many days learning from Frank Donovan and sharing his own stories, Jake Lawson began to understand that being a Navy SEAL was about more than missions and medals. It was about a lifelong commitment to courage, loyalty, and brotherhood. But now, it was time for Jake to face his own challenges outside the battlefield, to find peace within himself and honor the legacy passed down by Frank. One morning, Jake woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of loss and guilt that had pressed on him after his mentor's death began to lift, replaced by a new strength. He realized that carrying the memories of fallen brothers wasn't a burden to bear alone. It was a responsibility to live fully, to fight for what they believed in, and to help others who might be struggling like he had. Jake decided it was time to reach out beyond his small circle of SEALs. He wanted to connect with other veterans, to share stories, support one another, and break the silence around the pain many carried inside. Inspired by Frank's encouragement, Jake started organizing gatherings for veterans in the coastal town where Frank lived. The first meeting was small, with only a handful of men and women showing up, but it was powerful. They shared experiences from different wars, different battles, but all united by the common thread of service and sacrifice. Some spoke of the challenges of returning home, the difficulty in adjusting to civilian life, and the struggle with memories that refused to fade. Jake listened carefully to each story, realizing that he wasn't alone in his struggles. He offered support, drawing from the wisdom Frank had shared and his own experiences. Slowly, the group grew, becoming a community of healing and strength. As the gatherings continued, Jake noticed how much they helped him and others. The power of shared stories, empathy, and understanding began to heal old wounds. Veterans who once felt isolated now found a place to belong. Meanwhile, Jake kept visiting Frank, bringing news of the growing veteran community. Frank was proud to see the legacy of brotherhood thriving in a new way. Their friendship deepened, each man learning from the other. Frank reminded Jake that the spirit of the SEALs lived on not just in battle, but in how they cared for one another and their communities. One day, Jake received a call that shook him deeply. A young SEAL from his own team had been injured during a mission overseas. The news brought back the pain of loss and fear, but also the fierce determination to support his brother in need. Jake flew to the hospital and stayed by the injured SEAL's side, offering comfort and encouragement. He shared stories from Frank, stories of survival and hope, reminding the young man that he was part of a legacy of strength and courage. During that time, Jake realized how much the lessons from Frank's generation mattered. The old man's wisdom wasn't just history, it was a guide for living through the hardest times. Back in the coastal town, Jake and Frank worked together to create a small memorial garden dedicated to fallen SEALs and veterans from all wars. The garden became a place of reflection, honor, and community. Veterans, families, and locals came to pay respects and find peace. Jake often stood there thinking about the journey that had brought him from pain to purpose. He remembered the day he saw Frank's tattoo, the conversations that changed his life, and the brotherhood that crossed generations. He understood now that being a SEAL meant carrying the past with honor, living in the present with courage, and building a future filled with hope. Frank, too, found peace in this new chapter. The garden, the gatherings, and Jake's friendship gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his story would live on, not just in books or memories, but in the lives he touched. As the sun set over the ocean, Jake and Frank sat together in the garden. They watched the waves, feeling the quiet strength of the sea that had shaped their lives. Jake smiled and said, "I never thought I'd find this kind of peace." Frank nodded. "It's there all along. Sometimes you just need a brother to help you see it." Their journey was a testament to the power of connection, courage, and the enduring spirit of those who serve. It showed that no matter how far apart the generations, the bond of brotherhood and the strength of the human heart could overcome even the deepest wounds. Jake knew his story was still unfolding. With Frank's legacy guiding him and the community of veterans standing beside him, he was ready to face whatever came next. And in that moment, under the fading light of day, two warriors, one young, one old, shared a quiet victory. Not just over war, but over fear, pain, and loneliness. They had found each other, and in doing so, found a way to keep the spirit of the SEALs alive forever.